back to the Horror Academic, and as you may have noticed from the opening, we're switching things up a little bit. This is going to be the first episode in a series, a focus on sci-fi movies that are also important, that are, I would even say in some cases, horror adjacent. So, really quickly, I just want to tell you why this is important to me. So, yes, I am definitely a horror fan, known by many as horror aficionado, but I started as a sci-fi fan, and was actually not interested in horror until I was a teenager. But science fiction has been a constant throughout my life as a audience member and as a collector. So I just want to show you some of the series, some of the films that I think everyone should give a shot. Even if you don't consider yourself a sci-fi fan, or, if some stuff that you may have just let slide because it's not, it's a little older and still deserves some attention. So the best way, in my mind, to kick off anything science fiction is with the original franchise, the first franchise that took over the world. It wasn't Star Wars, it was Planet of the Apes. Sticking with our theory of focusing on Blu-rays you should own, I'm going to show off the 5-film collector set that 20th Century Fox put out. It has all 5 of the original Planet of the Apes films. Note the lack of a Tim Burton remake or anything that uses CG. Yeah, these films are all practical effects, practical makeup, and that's one of the reasons that they're still important today and have had such an impact on the world of movie-going when they came out. So this is what I recommend if you're looking to buy them now, and let's talk about why you would want to watch Planet of the Apes. Let's start out with the original film. The original Planet of the Apes, starring, of course, Charlton Heston as Taylor, the astronaut who he thinks to another planet, and spoiler, okay, these are very old at this point, guys, 1968, over 50 years ago, the world found out that Taylor did not actually go to another planet, he went to the future. And what did he find in the future? It was a planet of the apes. Of course, it was a post-apocalyptic world where the planet had succumbed to the nuclear war of man, and roles got switched. The apes took over, and the humans are now slaves, essentially. Let's talk a little bit about why this film came out, what was important about it at the time. As you may know, Planet of the Apes was based on a book by a French author, Pierre Boulle. The original title essentially translates to Planet of the Apes, but it is a Twilight Zone-like story, I'm going to say, where an astronaut goes to the future, finds out it's inhabited by apes. A lot of it follows the central storylines. Some differences, of course, is that the future is futuristic looking in the book. There's this kind of aristocracy, both visually, let's say, within the culture of the apes. The settings, the clothing, the technology, that matches fairly close to Earth would have been at the time of the writing of the book, in the 60s. But what's different is that in the film, the apes live in a more primitive environment. The book is essentially a political satire of French culture in the 60s. Boulle is very aware of this, and it's very intentional. He says he got the idea for the story by a visit to the zoo and how humanistic the qualities of the simians, the apes and chimpanzees that he saw there were, and thought, well, what if they could take over? They practically look like us anyway. So it's very anti-colonialist in its story, that humans feel that we have the ability to take over the planet. How poorly we treat the environment, how poorly we treat each other. These are themes that emanate from the book. So there's a lot that he's trying to say, and it's honestly a very short story. The entire book, 128 pages. lot of story in under 28 pages. Important to note that Boole was also the author of Bridge on the River Kwai, and he had fought in World War II and had been held as a prisoner, so it definitely affected many of the theories that ran throughout his fiction, as it would, right? So originally, the rights to Planet of the Apes is bought by a production house known as the King Brothers. And the King Brothers, most notably, are I believe they're a British duo who financed the films Gorgo, which is, you know, a bit of a Godzilla rip, but it's somewhere between that and Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. It's a fun movie. It's not exactly groundbreaking, but of the monster movies of the 60s, it's an enjoyable film. Particularly good Mystery Science Theater episode out there of Gorgo. Check it out. But the King Brothers could not afford to finance Planet of the Apes. They had a couple of failed projects, and it wasn't in the horizon for them. So that's when Arthur P. Jacobs steps in. He essentially is enamored with this and decides we need to make this happen. This can be a film. And he works with Boole, essentially, at first, to create what will become the first film. And Arthur P. Jacobs, he brings it to Warner Brothers. They do this whole thing. He's got all these artists come in, concept artists, to draw what would the Planet of the Apes look like, what would the apes look like as, you know, human-like characters. And what he does is he's trying to find the right screenwriter to help bring the film to the big screen. Boole had worked on some screenplay versions of his works in the past, but what they did was, so they had him make some draft, and then they bring in Rod Serling. Now Rod Serling, obviously, especially to sci-fi fans, he's the creator of the Twilight Zone, Night Gallery. He is kind of, especially in the 60s, he is kind of the face of serious science fiction, on television at least. What Serling brings to the project is, here's his ability, and he's reading in this story, this conflict, right? And he's been having a hard time finding a way to bring the serious stories that he wants to bring to television. And he wanted to tell the story of civil rights in America. And he was having a hard time getting the way to do that. He does get some little bits and pieces in once the Twilight Zone is up and running, really. But he never can really fully explore it as much as he would like. So he sees Planet of the Apes as the opportunity to do that. Part of this is also this kind of class system that comes to be part of the story, is that the apes are sort of divided. So it's not just apes over humans, but it's even apes subdividing themselves, much like humans, where humans are kept in cages and humans are de-evolved to being dumb and mute, like animals in this way. The society that the apes have built also kind of structures itself to put certain species on top. In this order, you have the orangutans, who are the lawgivers. The orangutans are the head of the government, and they are also the head of the religion, which tells a lot about what we're trying to say about society. This kind of marrying of government and religion, even though we're supposed to separate those things, right? So you have the orangutans who are in charge. Below the orangutans, you have the chimpanzees, who are the scientists or the thinkers of the group, the philosophers. So you have this character of Zira, who's kind of a zoologist psychologist, who is exploring the bonds and links and differences between species of apes and man. And then you have, say, Cornelius, who is a historian. He is an archaeologist. He's trying to explore the history of the planet that they live on. So you have this kind of intellectual level below the kind of governing bodies. And then at the bottom of that food chain are the gorillas. And the gorillas are the military. The gorillas are violent in nature. The gorillas are, some might say, the most human-like of the group. And this class structure also, some have denoted to the skin tone of the different apes. The darkest of the apes are the gorillas, and they are at the bottom of the food chain. The lightest being the orangutans, chimpanzees being in the center. All of these things can be read into race, class, societal structure. So Serling takes what Boole has started and he really dives into that further. So aside from the issues of race and class that Serling brings to the project, there is also this underlying theme of nuclear fear, which is very prevalent in the Twilight Zone, and in most science fiction of the 1960s, because it was very much a threat to all of society. It's something that everyone felt deeply, and it is this undercurrent, because we know this is a post-apocalyptic story. How did we get here? And then when we find out at the end, it just justifies this fear, and it shows that man does have the ability to destroy themselves. So that nuclear fear also starts to come in to this kind of stage of the script writing. So you have Boole's book, you have as the inspiration, the kickoff, you have Serling adding these metaphors and deep meanings, and then you have one more layer. So at this point the project has moved from Warner Brothers to 20th Century Fox, because Jacobs is just kind of shopping it around to try and find who would be willing to put up the, a more appropriate budget for the project. So Jacobs then, in order to prove to 20th Century Fox, what he does is he takes one scene that Serling had written, and he has a makeup test done, and he brings in his proposed casting even. So we have Heston's already playing the role of Taylor. Zira has not been cast yet, so you have his wife, Trundy, playing the role of Zira, and she will show up later in the series quite a bit. And the character of Dr. Zaius is famously, in this one scene, played by Edward G. Robinson. This was enough to prove, okay, look, we can make this happen. The makeup can look realistic. This is definitely something we can do. So the thing is that Robinson going through that one day of of makeup test was like, all right, I'm out. I can never do that again. It makes me claustrophobic. So they had to search for a new Zaius, but they had time because they're asked for one more set of rewrites. This is when they bring in Michael Wilson. His background as a writer includes the fact that he had been part of the blacklist that had been in this kind of Red Scare trials of the kind of anti-communist, un-American trials. So he furthered what Serling had started by using allegory to discuss prejudice. You see how, particularly in the trial scene, where Taylor is brought up to the orangutan council, and this trial happens, and the focus eventually shifts to Cornelius and Zira's work as being heretics, and how they are pushing too far, and how they are treading on very soft ground, and they basically, the orangutans, let them speak in order to kind of hang themselves. And this scene particularly does show how Wilson felt about his own trial that he had been on. One thing also that he does to match the demands of Jacobs and then the new producer Zanuck, who's been brought in by Fox, is to say, we can't afford to make the future. So he makes it more rustic, more kind of primitive in nature, and that gives them the freedom to create a whole new look and something that is far more in budget. So that's kind of the history of how Planet of the Apes got made. What happens then is basically it becomes a huge phenomena. It's a huge hit. It's a film that touches on so many important topics. It uses so many moments as kind of almost teaching moments in a way that science fiction does. Good horror does this as well, and we see this particularly in George Romero's work, and even in Carpenter's work at times, where, like Serling had been experiencing, it's hard to get a message across when you want to say something so specifically about something that's a hot topic of the day, and where the studio, and particularly in television, may say, there's no way we're going to let you make a film about race relations in the country. But if you say, well, what if it's a film about apes and man? Oh, okay, that's science fiction, sure, do whatever you want. So it opens these doors, and sci-fi does that so well. You have Charlton Heston in this kind of breakout performance. I mean, Charlton Heston had already been a huge name. I mean, this is years after Ben-Hur. But this kind of is the middle of this kind of trilogy that he creates, particularly of like sci-fi classics that are all post-apocalyptic, all very bleak in nature. And you have Soylent Green, Planet of the Apes, and the Omega Man. And Heston at this point just kind of becomes this kind of symbol of, you know, the last man struggling to survive in a society that's falling apart, or the man who's going to blow it all open. So in the beginning of the movie, Heston is with a group of other astronauts that are leaving Earth, and he's kind of pontificating about how, you know, what are we leaving behind, but even more importantly, what is the future? And what is the future of man? So he's already on this trip of trying to figure out, we're destined to failure in what's going on already. And how is mankind going to survive? And will I find out something from outer space or the future that will prove to me that man will survive? And what happens? He ends up going through this entire film thinking he's on an alien planet. And of course, at the very end of that, he iconically sees the Statue of Liberty and knows, in fact, he was right. Mankind totally messed up. They blew the bomb. So it's also very kind of 1968, right? So it's kind of this place where you can have that bummer ending because the world is kind of feeling it with him. Everything's going to hell, right? There's a lot throughout these films we're going to see. This film starts it, but as it progresses, you're going to see a lot that's going to talk about very much what we're feeling, not just in the civil rights movement going on, but also in this kind of anti-Vietnam movement as well, where, you know, society is kind of just trying to fight back. And these films very much are telling that story in its own way. A couple other moments that I think are key. I've used this film in the classroom, and one thing I think is important to get across is that you have a title that ruins pretty much the first big, you know, spoiler of the film, right? Where does he land? Oh, he lands on a planet of the apes. So we know there's going to be a planet full of apes. So that's already like, hey, spoiler in the title, spoiler on the poster, spoiler in the trailer. But they do this impressive ability in the opening sequences of the film, the deserts of the American West, to show this vastness, this emptiness. It feels like it could be an alien place. There's a reason why so much of Star Trek is shot in, like, the original Star Trek series and even Next Gen later. Is so much of it's shot in the deserts of California and Nevada because it feels alien. It looks different. It does not look like the lush green earth that we're used to seeing. So they spent a lot of time there. The director, Franklin Schaffner, actually got a little bit of heat from the producers. Like, why are we spending days and days filming these opening scenes of them walking in the desert? You could have done that day one and be done. And he said it was important to him to prove how alien the planet they were in and how to set this tone of isolation to make the audience understand the feel of the films. He felt it was very important to set that early, and by showing those vast scenes high above, showing the three survivors from the trip walking through, and it's effective. It does make you feel like you're in the middle of some Mars landscape or something. But so as you go from all that, they finally find that, you know, a little bit of, like, there's one plant growing, and then from there they see grass and trees, and then they see the waterfall. They dive into the waterfall. But what happens from here is that everything changes on them. A, they find that there's people, humanoids. They don't seem to be able to communicate with them, and they're very primitive. But what they do notice is when they're scared. And here they're thinking, hey, we're going to be kings, right? Because these people can't even talk. And here we march in, we know science and technology. That only lasts for a minute before reality sets in. And reality sets in that famous hunt scene where the horn goes off, you hear gunshots, you hear the hooves of horses coming through with the soldiers, and they don't reveal it right away. They don't show you right away, even though you know, Planet of the Apes. Even though you know, they don't reveal who's on top of these horses. When they do, they show horse, then they angle up, slow reveal, and it's shocking. How could it be shocking when you knew going into the movie it was going to be Planet of the Apes? But it is. And that's some effective filmmaking right there that, if nothing else to take away from this film, I think that's pretty impressive. So this hunt scene, obviously, it's the apes rounding up the humans that have tread too far into their land and should have stayed in their own village or whatever, and, you know, they're eating the crops that are supposedly the ape crops. There's all that, you know, reasoning for why they're hunting, but essentially it's apes hunting humans. These hunt scenes are vicious and violent. What happens after the hunt is important. So they use nets, they use guns, there's just stampedes of humans trying to get away from these, these soldiers on these horses. But aftermath of this hunt is you see carriages that are like cages that the humans are being loaded into. You see the dead humans piled, a pile of bodies. You see apes near, stringing up bodies of humans. And then you see 3 ape soldiers posing for a camera over the bodies of humans that they have killed in the hunt. And it's this trophy pose, and they're locking arms, guns in hand. They're proud of this moment. Between the images of hanging humans, the human bodies on the ground, the posed images, it's impossible to not bring up images of lynching. You might not have been thinking it when you saw it, but there is a part of you, if you're American particularly, that will go back to photos you've seen of lynches. And that's A, powerful, and B, that's amazing that they got that in there. Again, science fiction, it's okay, because it's all fantasy, but totally telling that story. At the same time, to me, as the horror academic, of course this makes me think of The Hunt from Dawn of the Dead. So when the helicopter's going over Pittsburgh and they see the rednecks, and all these rednecks are probably enjoying this, and the rednecks are out there shooting down the zombies, having some beer and coffee, hanging out, laughing, making jokes, posing for photos, and piling up the bodies. These films came out, let's see, Dawn of the Dead was a few years later, so I don't assume this to be a callback, but I do believe it was a callback to Night of the Living Dead. If both films weren't trying to tell the story, they both did it inadvertently. And at the same time, to see images of human bodies stacked up of the dead. So, Night of the Living Dead and Planet of the Apes to me have so many things in common, and that's the number one. It shows these images that even if you're not meaning to, will make you think of the civil rights struggle, and you can even think, particularly later in the film where Taylor's in a cage and he's got the hose on him and he's screaming, "It's a madhouse, can't not have that scene," because that's just, that's one of the most quotable moments in the film. You have to think of rioting, you have to think of police versus protesters, all of this together. It's 1968. It might not be right here in your brain, but it's somewhere back here. So, amazing that they get this stuff through. We already talked about the importance of the courtroom scene, but I'm going to also emphasize that there's a lot of things about this scene particularly that will make you think of the monkey trial. No pun intended, right? But Darwin's trial, that is it heresy or is it against God to say that evolution happened? And that's precisely what Zira is saying, and Cornelius, but they're saying it in reverse, right? So that the simian man evolved from human. Now, this is extremely clever the way it's done. There's even the moment where the orangutans refuse to listen because it would be corrupting them more to listen to this kind of speech. And what you get is the classic, hear no evil, say no evil, see no evil, right? You got the orangutans lined up doing that. That's just one of the most ingenious images in film to me, that whole sequence of the trial. I love these moments that just put on its head American society, particularly. There's a moment where Taylor is running through the streets, right? And he's gotten out, but he's being chased by some gorillas, and he goes through all these different scenes. And one of them is he's hiding where a funeral is taking place, and you hear these things like, that the preacher is talking about the deceased and how he says, famously, he never met an ape he didn't like. That whole scene of apes in a church having a ceremony for the dead can't help but make you think, yeah, that's weird that we do that, right? Yeah. And then even more so when he goes to the Natural History Museum and you see these stuffed displays. And in the displays, instead of animals from the wild, it's humans. And it's kind of these primitive native humans that we see, and they're made like statues in these diorama sets, the same way when we go to the Natural History Museum, we see animals set up like that. This is weird. This is strange. Why do we do this? That's what the movie is saying to me. It's saying, look, isn't it weird when you do this with people? So why do we do this with animals? Yeah. So there was the 3 astronauts in the beginning of the film, and when he comes around the corner, he sees Dodge. Dodge had been the scientist of the group, and he was a black man, and he is different from what most of the primitive humans look like, so of course he gets a prominent display in this museum that they've set up. So putting otherness, othering people by putting them on display. Of course, the other astronaut who originally survives the crash is Landon, and later, as part of his trial, all of the other humans that were corralled with Taylor are brought out, and he finds Landon, and of course Landon's been lobotomized. Makes you can't not think of bizarre practices that were done, particularly in wartime, or supposedly for the betterment of society, where we've done experiments on other humans, or experiments we've done on animals. So all of that comes to mind when you see this image of Landon with his lobotomized speech area, of course. It's a film just full, it's just jam-packed with images of metaphor. It's a reason why it still holds up today, the reason why it's an iconic film, it's a reason why it's a movie that in some ways sums up the 60s from a major motion picture company. This is not an independent film in any way that tells so much of the 60s in this story, the late 60s particularly, this kind of rage that's felt by society. Another point that really sums this up is in the very final moments, of course, they end up at the dig in the Forbidden Zone, and this had been Cornelius's dig, and in the dig you can see the time layers that you do in any archaeological dig, and the items that are below kind of the simian timeline are human. These are definitely human items. There is this skeleton of man, there is a doll, a baby doll, a human baby doll, which is strange, and of course Taylor reveals that the other items that are found are eyeglasses, false teeth, I believe a heart valve, and that's when we find out from Nova, the human that has been kind of made a pet offering to Taylor. That's still a little awkward, but Nova picks up the doll, and of course the doll talks. No ape would ever make a doll where a human speaks, because humans don't speak in this society, and it just proves Taylor's point. Obviously, we were here first. And then, before he goes off to find out his destiny, Dr. Zaius reads the 29th scroll, I believe it is. The 29th scroll tells us to beware the beast man. It is the prophecy of the apes that tells that they know man not only is violent in nature, but he will destroy himself if you give him enough room. And that's probably the biggest moment for me in the film, is that 29th scroll. So you have a film that is probably one of the most quotable movies in movie history. I mean, like I said, we got that madhouse line. Of course, there's the first time that Taylor speaks in public is the, get your paws off me, you damn stinking ape. You have, moments where you hear human see, human do. It's chock full of these lines. And there's so many things about this that are iconic. Last couple things I want to say is that you have to remember the reason why Planet of the Apes works so well is that makeup. And that year at the Oscars, the film was up for Best Score. Jerry Goldsmith, who did the Omen score and many others, which is a very unnerving score, and it also, working with those images early in the film, does make you feel like you're in an alien landscape. So the score is extremely effective. It's very different for the time. It's not particularly orchestrated as much as it's an arrangement. So score is amazing. It was up for Best Costumes. So what the Academy does end up doing, though, is giving them an award for special achievement in makeup effects. That goes to John Chambers. Chambers is, of course, the man who is the mastermind behind the prosthetics and how the apes are able to look so real. And, of course, his makeup design goes throughout the film series, the TV series, and it becomes kind of the standard way to make this happen. And he does so much really to make this possible even. So, got to make sure you mention Chambers when you talk about Planet of the Apes. I will say there's one last thing that I learned in one of the many documentaries about the film, is that there was an unused sequence that was going to be originally a part of the ending where you find out Nova is pregnant. So here's a mute human female who is pregnant with Taylor's child, and there's all kind of implications of, you know, they were trying to set this up for a totally different type of sequel, and you even see mention of that when they're working on the first sequel, that there's this creation of a makeup test for a half ape, half human child. But in the end they decide that that is not the message they want to put across, almost like that's too hopeful. Or also that they were worried that they would lose this G rating that they're so, you know, enamored with this whole series, except for Conquest, which we'll get to, is a G-rated series because it's supposed to be family friendly. So they said interspecies mating, you know, would just be too much for the censors, so that gets nixed. But you get, because of it, this super bleak ending, and where could it possibly go from there? So let's break down some of the stuff I have that is specifically the first film real quick. I did not keep all of my, well, first off, I had the whole series on VHS. I did not keep those. I gladly pitched those when I got the DVDs. Did not keep all of them, but I do have the original signed by Nova, Linda Harrison. Harrison, who I believe was the girlfriend of producer Zanuck when these pictures were being made. We have Poole's novelization, but this is the movie tie-in version of Poole's novel, obviously. So these are some pretty important parts of my collection. So this is the end of part 1, this look at the original Planet of the Apes. Come back next time and we'll look at the 4 sequels to the original film and talk a little bit about my collecting them and all the other things that there are to learn about the world of the Planet of the Apes.
Hello, is anybody out there? Anybody. This is Jim Cobb. If you are hearing this, the worst has happened. I've recorded a podcast at the end of the world and will broadcast it on channel PEN every Friday. It's all about the apocalypse, books, movies, TV, how much food and water will you need your bunker, all that kind of stuff.
Excuse me, sir. You're gonna have to keep the noise down. You're in a library, and you're scaring the kids. The world hasn't ended yet.
Sorry, ma'am.
Shh. You're in the library at the end of the world with host Jim Cobb.
Fridays, exclusively on Project Entertainment Network.
This has been a presentation of the Project Entertainment Network.